Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. We're hearing a lot right now about the Teck Frontier mine, and the federal government has a decision to make before the end of February as to whether or not they're going to approve it. And there's a lot of really overheated rhetoric on both sides. On the one side, this is going to be a massive project that's going to create all kinds of jobs and employment and economic opportunity in Alberta. And on the other side, there's this notion that this mine is going to essentially burn through the country's carbon budget, and it'll be nothing but driving up emissions and so on and so on. Both of those are not necessarily accurate depictions of what is going on and what the choice is. And so I figured I'd take a couple minutes and just walk through some of the considerations that are at play with this project. One of the first things I would say is on the subject of the carbon budget, a lot of the figures that are being thrown around are as though this project was not something over a 40-year horizon, but as though it would be built, the oil sands would be mined and consumed and burned within a short period of time, which is not how this project is really actually supposed to work. So yes, there are absolutely concerns about increasing emissions, but we need to temper a little bit about what some of those fears or expectations of them are actually going to be. On the other side of the equation, there's a lot of talk about how great this project would be and why it deserves approval, and a lot of that has been based on some torqued talking points as to the positives of this project. For example, there's a lot of talk about how the Alberta oil sands are world leaders in emission reductions, and that's not really true. Some projects have made intensity reductions, which means that the amount of emissions per barrel has gone down, but that's only a handful of projects, and overall the emissions are still increasing. So it's really hard to say with a straight face that they have been world leaders in emission reductions. There's a lot of talk about how this particular proposal from Teck would somehow be lower emissions than any other project, and that's not true either. The company itself said that their emissions would be around the median level, but this has kind of been torqued and spun as the emissions being better than are actually being proposed by the company. There have been a lot of talking points about how this project has undergone scientific review and that it's been given a green light by the assessment agency. And that's also not really exactly true. The assessment agency did go through the environmental assessment, and they did note that there were concerns with a lot of what is being proposed in there. There would be significant adverse impacts to the environment in the area, and not only that, but they had laid out conditions, pages and pages of conditions that would need to be met for the project to not have the impact that they say they're going to have. So again, it's, the language that's being used to sell this project is a little bit misleading. Just in the last week, we've also started hearing, Teck is committed to ensuring that the project is net zero emissions by 2050. And again, that's not true either. Teck said they're looking to ensure their global emissions are net zero by 2050, but that is a lot of other kinds of mining activity in plenty of other countries. It is a big company, there are plenty of operations, but Teck Frontier in particular, this particular oil sands mine, they have not said they're going to get it to net zero by 2050. And even then, just saying you're going to be able to do that without actually giving some concrete examples as to how they're going to achieve that is just basically hand-waving and possibly relying on some techno-salvation to hope that one day in the near future they will develop a technology that will reduce their emissions to a great amount, and that's not something anyone can actually count on. So again, a lot of overblown language is being used to sell the merits of the project that isn't necessarily reflected in reality. One of the other criticisms that's being laid at the feet of the federal government is that they have to do the political assessment of the environmental assessment. And that is a requirement that really came in under the Stephen Harper Conservatives, whose framework for assessments this project is being judged against. And what exactly that means is that they ensured that Cabinet makes the final decision on any of these projects. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Scientific assessments are not public policy. And public policy and political discussions are about the balancing act for adverse impacts on the environment versus economic impacts, for jobs and growth and so on. So it's actually a pretty good thing to have Cabinet being able to make that kind of a decision, because then you've also got political accountability. You know who you can hold to account if things don't live up to the promise that was being sold to them. So that's something that the Conservatives put into place. They're complaining right now about this arbitrary process, but it's their arbitrary process if we're going to call it that. So it's something they should take a little bit of ownership for, and not just treat this environmental assessment process like it's supposed to be some kind of a technocratic rubber stamp. That's not how the system works, and they should actually know that because they put this particular system into place. The other thing about the rhetoric around this project that I find really concerning is this notion that if the federal government says no to it, then that's somehow saying no to Alberta in Confederation, and that this is going to be a signal to all kinds of foreign investment that Canada's closed for investment. And that's absurd, and it's not true. And it's also completely against what the company itself has been saying. In terms of the broader picture now, we also need to remember that the Bank of Canada has pointed out that the digital economy in Canada is larger than all of oil, gas, and mining combined in the country. So it's not making up the share of the economy that it used to, and we need to be cognizant of that when we're talking about, the doom scenarios of if these projects don't happen. The other thing that really needs to be pointed out again and again is that the CEO of Teck has said that even if they get the approval from the federal government for this, it doesn't mean the project is going to go ahead. In order for that to happen, they need another partner, they need more pipeline capacity, and they need the price of oil to be higher. In order for a project like Teck Frontier to be viable, the price of oil needs to be at least $75 a barrel, and it's currently hovering around 50. And it's unlikely to get to 75 anytime in the near future because of the global supply glut and the shale revolution in the US. That's changed the market dynamics for oil dramatically in the last decade. And these kinds of major projects, even when they're approved, aren't getting built. There's at least half a dozen other major oil sands projects in Alberta that were proposed, that went through the environmental assessment process, that got their approvals, and are not moving anywhere because they're no longer economically viable given the current state of the price of gas and so on. And it's not government red tape, and it's not more regulations, and it's not carbon pricing that's at the heart of this issue here. It's that the market is changing. And these particular kinds of projects are not viable in a low oil price environment. Once upon a time when we thought that peak oil was right around the corner, the rising cost of it would make these kinds of projects more economically viable. But that didn't happen. And so, the grand plans for this kind of oil sands expansion is no longer what is in kind of the economic cards or in the market. So all this doomsaying about, if Teck doesn't get approved, then that's the end. doesn't really hold any water. Even if it does get approved, it's almost certain that it's not going to be built. So all of the doomsaying, both on the environmental side and the industry side, is really kind of all for naught, because there simply aren't the economic conditions to make this kind of a project viable. And I know people like Jason Kenney and a number of federal conservatives are trying to, prod the government and, trying to make this case that, if this doesn't get approved, it's going to mean Western separation. That is completely absurd. Like I said, the economic conditions simply aren't there, even if it does get approval, and that's not something the federal government or even the provincial government can do anything about. They don't control the world price of oil, and that's kind of at the heart of all of this. So essentially, while we wait for the federal government to come up with that decision, let's all just kind of take a breath and, poke holes in some of the talking points that both sides have been throwing around and realize that this project is not going to be the make or break for either the Alberta economy or GHG emissions around the world or in the country. It's a complex ecosystem, but there's room for nuance, and we'll see what the economy looks like in the coming months, years, when it comes to things like the price of oil. But the kind of outsized rhetoric over this project is a bit much, and we should tone it down. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.